conversation I was having today with my mom, and we've had this kind of conversation, or at least we talked a little bit about it in terms of music and where it comes from. See, my mom is, she's in her 70s, and she's been around a while, and she loves music. She grew up ran around the 60s and 70s and collected a lot of records and things of that nature. This is, of course, a video voiceover for my channel, but I wanted to talk about something I think is kind of interesting in terms of the way she consumed music and the way that, of course, I consume music. I'm in my 40s, and now I would say today, music is consumed. And for my mom, a lot of things as far as she grew up in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and until now, and mostly the things that I could say that stand out about her generation and growing up is that there really wasn't a lot of selection for everything. When it came to growing up, TV was just kind of becoming a thing. As far as stations and entertainment and stuff as movies, you really had limited possibilities. Of course, when it came to music, it was kind of very much similar. When you wanted to have an experience with music, before you could really buy a record, you'd have to go to a concert, you have to pay money, and hopefully listen to it on the radio. But of course, as time progressed, the thing that was really great about it is that you could get not only just songs, but entire albums from artists and that sort of thing. And there was an experience that was had by doing that. And so today we were talking about, the differences between that then during my time and of course today, which is music is consumed a kind of piecemeal. You can purchase songs separately, which you could do for a while, even going back to the 60s and 70s a bit on a single. But in order to really get all the songs or really get the entire experience by an artist, you really had, and there really weren't any other options besides buying the album. And so the reason that we were kind of talking about that is that through the years, you get people who are, I would say, aficionados, people who follow music, follow trends, follow a lot of this or that. And when it comes to music, I think for my mom, it was a deeply personal experience. It was one that she enjoyed. She liked a lot of different categories of music and so on. But the thing is that along with the fact that I think if you ask most people about the music that they listened to in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even till today, you sort of really only get a handful of greatest hits, number ones, or popular music. You don't necessarily get an entire catalog that is appreciated by, I want to say, a lot. I don't want to get into kind of the numbers specifically, but it just seems as if, from my experience, that most people, if they tell you that they like an artist or music, especially in the mainstream we're talking about it in the media, you're usually only really talking about the most popular or the favorite hits that got a lot of rotation on the radio and got a lot of publishing. And the thing of it is that, and the reason that I bring this up here is that for all the songs, and we'll take Elvis Presley for an example. I mean, he released a lot of music, more than just Blue Suede Shoes and Jailhouse Rock, and maybe the few that you usually hear very often. He did gospel music, he did some kind of folksy country music. And the thing that I think is always kind of interesting is, at least back in my day, VH1 used to do a series called kind of Behind the Music, where they would have, or not, but I can't remember the name of it. It was a program, basically, it's like Lenny Kravitz, for example, would play music. He'd be at more of a kind of intimate engagement, and he would not only perform music, but he would actually take questions from people that were in the audience about the music and where it came from, and just, general overall things, a real intimate fan experience. And the really weird thing is they did this for other artists as well, and it was really, really interesting. But it was also educational, because sometimes, and it depended, of course, on the artist that you would get, they would reveal things that really, if you were doing more than just hearing them, but listening, you'd find out that some of the most popular artists, some of the most popular songs really got that way by ways that most people maybe don't really understand. And what I mean by that, for example, if you sometimes would ask an artist who's really well known for a song, particularly, and you may ask them if it's their favorite song or where it came from. If you really did a sit down, if you really did something where they kind of opened up, you'd find some really interesting answers. From sometimes the greatest hit they ever had is one that they don't like very much, one that might have happened purely by accident, or it might be a song that they really didn't like very much, but because of their contract or because the studio or label that they were signed with pushed this song, and because they thought it was catchy or it would sell. So, and when I say that, I think of a lot of the more popular music that people like by artists, but then I also think of the music that doesn't get recognized at all. Music that, keep in mind that, like, back in the 60s and 70s, an entire album might have about 10 songs, sometimes even more. Sometimes less, I think, too, but generally you had about 10 songs. And of those 10 songs, maybe less than half of them would really, be a hit. And even less than that would be a number one, and one that they would be recognized for. Now, I'm not talking about like what's deemed as one-hit wonders or anything like that. I'm specifically speaking of artists that would make music that was loved by a lot of people, but maybe not necessarily for the reasons that people know. And when I talked about in the beginning there, the way that music is consumed, when you bought an entire album, and I want to say like with Prince, for example, you not only just got, different songs that you may or may not like. One of the things that I kind of gathered from Prince was that he wanted to make it in an overall experience from beginning to end, from your first song that was on the album to the last one. And truth be told, some of the songs that they made may not be necessarily as popular, but they might be more personal, or they might be actually favorites of the artist over songs that may have got more airplay, may have become more popular. And in some cases, if you got to see one of these interviews where, the artist might open up to, an audience in a kind of an intimate way, you find out there's plenty of songs that don't even make it to the album. Sometimes they're held over for later, or sometimes they're never heard at all. I think one of the times I was listening to an interview by Mariah Carey, and she talked about, if my memory's not failing me, about songs and music that never really made it to any of her albums that were really some of her favorite. So the reason I bring this up is because I think it's interesting that when we think about music and the way we consume it now, then, or even further in the past, I often wonder about those idiosyncrasies, those details that oftentimes get overlooked, even from specific areas or places that are usually considered very, very educated, very well informed, very much dedicated to certain kinds of musics and genre. The fact that there's so much music that isn't in the popular scope that either gets missed, dismissed, or doesn't even exist on the radar of most people. And I'm not even talking about one-hit wonders or people who don't get the publishing. I'm talking about really, really great bands, great albums, great artists that are well known, but yet still people know next to very little or nothing about those bands or artists. And it's primarily because sometimes people that call themselves, fans or fanatics or people that love them, I kind of wonder how much they truly listen to the material that an artist makes. Like, for example, I mentioned again Prince. He very much seemed towards the later years, during like my years, like Napster and of course YouTube Online, and of course the invention or the pay per song type of setup. I can't think of the right way to word that, but he wasn't really a fan of that. He wasn't a fan of music being made that he didn't make most of the lion's share of the portion of the work he did. But he also didn't necessarily like the fact that much of his music was consumed in a way that wasn't appreciated the way that he particularly meant it, that it was sometimes consumed without any kind of payment or any kind of appreciation, at least in his view. At least that's the way it seemed to me. I'm talking about money, obviously financially, but in a lot of other ways. And so I think the reason that I wanted to bring that up, at least in this video voiceover, is because I think that's interesting and I think that's important. And I also think that it applies to a lot of other arts like movies, TV, theater. A lot of what gets consumed, maybe you consume it because you obviously want to listen to your favorite. You obviously want to be involved or come to the things that you either appreciate or have learned to appreciate. But at the same time, I kind of wonder what that might do to us. The fact that, starting off in the 50s, the way that we consumed all kinds of different art to the way that we consume it now. And maybe not just now, but I'm saying that we've always consumed it. The way that it's been sold, the way it's been produced, the way it's been marketed. I think there's something to be said for all of that, but I think it's an interesting way to think about, a lot of things in terms of, I think you can say a lot of our social conditioning, and I don't mean that in some kind of sinister or a conspiratorial way. I'm just simply saying that the way that our society has kind of formed and the way that we, produce things, I think some of that has to do with engineering, but I think it's maybe not so much as nefarious as it is, I think sometimes the collective in organizations of any kind can kind of tend to lean towards behavior and sometimes culture and traditions that sometimes are appreciated and evaluated for what they are, but in many times things are completely overlooked. Like I said before, I think if you asked a lot of fans now, and even back then when my mom was coming up in my time, there were, I mean, people went out there, they bought albums, they consumed the whole thing. I definitely remember doing that. And I can honestly tell you that during that time and doing those things, there are plenty of songs that I think oftentimes get recognized. And some of the albums that I bought were from more popular artists, but many of the songs and many of the material that I got a chance to be exposed to because I bought an album, usually particularly because of a certain song or songs or an artist that I liked for a variety of other reasons. Other things that they produced or they were part of really almost never got exposure in the way that I would say now is almost a must. It has to absolutely be successful. It has to absolutely be a number one hit. And I know I'm talking about music, but we were also talking about movies and television. Like I mentioned this about Star Trek. I mean, Star Trek, the very first Star Trek, and it's been around for close to 70 years now or more. It was not a success. People did not like Star Trek at all. I mean, it did okay against a lot of other things, but for example, Gene Roddenberry, it didn't really seem as if he really, he was successful, but he didn't really get the hearing, I think, from NBC the way that he had hoped. And I don't think it was always quite as successful as he envisioned. In fact, it was on for 3 years. It barely made the second year. And then, of course, in the third year, they kept around, they brought him back. It ultimately wasn't a flop. Otherwise, I don't think it would have lasted the first year. But I think in terms of it being, the legacy that it is today, I think sometimes that can get misconstrued or viewed in a skewed kind of way for something that it was not. I mean, I love Star Trek. I enjoy Gene Roddenberry's vision, but whether it was the original, the movies, or even the Next Generation, I think his vision for it and what it ultimately became to become had a lot to do with him being the creator. But I think it had an awful lot to do with a lot of other input. Some may say good, some may say bad. But I don't think it was readily just genius the way some people conclude it to be, or legendary, or, destined to be great. I think a lot of it had to do with chance, opportunity, where people were, a lot of those things. And the reason I bring that up, just like along with the music, I apply it to like a lot of TV shows now. TV shows or music now, where it's hard to kind of get a beat on things. And I think sometimes through a critical type of lens, people, I think, tend to have a skewed idea, especially, things that get produced and you watch them or you like them. And sometimes they'll be unfairly reviewed, criticized, and a lot of times rejected or ultimately canceled because, I guess, if they weren't a runaway hit or accepted immediately, then I guess apparently that just means everything was all wrong, so maybe why even bother? And so I think of these things that I mentioned here, and I think it's important to know that I think whether it's individually, or as a society, we have blind spots. We have things that generally get overlooked, and maybe it's for better and maybe it's for worse, but I definitely think about that in terms of what comes next now, where things began, how they've developed, and maybe at least for myself where I need to go, or where what I look for to come next. And so I think I think it's important to consider these things because I think when sometimes people, I'll give Star Wars an example. I remember the original trilogy, Star Wars 1, 2, and 3, and I distinctly remember people kind of hating the last not Empire Strikes Back, but Return of the Jedi. And I specifically remembered a lot of hate for what was the Ewoks that made an appearance in the third one, which people really didn't necessarily appreciate. You know, these little 4-foot creatures that were obviously some people felt like it was Lucas's way of trying to appeal to kids and merchandising and things like that, and try to incorporate a little bit of the cuteness in terms of his of the Star Wars universe. But it definitely came back to me when the prequels came out, and I remember a lot of the really heavy criticism for Jar Jar Binks, which I think kind of had the exact same reaction from audiences. I think there were some other reactions too, like, Anakin, the young actor that played him, and criticisms about some of the story. And just like with the original Star Wars, the three movies, the prequels had their criticisms and things of that nature. And, some people say their wins and their losses. But then, of course, then came the sequels, and it was really very much a lot of the same exact thing. And I think that happens because when you get into making movies of any kind, I mean, you're going to have criticism. You're going to have people that are going to consume it in the way that's best for them. But I think it definitely begs to ask the question of what lens we're looking at and seeing things from. I can say, for example, for me personally, I never liked The Godfather. I never watched it. I mean, I've seen it. I've seen clips of it. I understand why it's a fabulous film. It's shot very well. It's technically seems to be everything that a film should be, but it's just not a story that I enjoy. And I don't hate it, but at the same time, I don't enjoy it. And I certainly, can't blame anyone who does. I mean, some things are just not for everyone. And so I think, at least for me, I see and I hear a little bit of that when it comes to these things, as far as what becomes popular and what doesn't, in terms of, like I said, how it's consumed, the lens from which we see it. And so I think there's something to be considered there. I think sometimes looking back at things, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I see things now in terms of movies and shows that, quite frankly, even back then, might not have been as good as I remembered them being, or I remember them better than they actually were because of, again, that lens from where I saw it. So, just things that I think about in terms of my passions and things that I enjoy and consider when it comes to socially and being socially awkward as I am, but also seeing things through my own lens and my own view, and weighing that compared to what I hear and see from those around me in that same range. I think I don't think anything I'm saying is monumental or earth-shattering or anything like that, but it really was just something that I felt like talking about and wanted to point out in a video voiceover, because this is something that I really think about when it comes to the way I consume things, as opposed to the way I did things before. And I try to appreciate that because I do understand and realize that while all things do change, why they change, what happens, when I see a movie or TV show, I think some of the things that gives me hesitation, at least a little bit sometimes, has to do with the fact that, if you set aside that I am now older and the material may or may not resonate, but even shows that I sometimes want to give it a chance or things, whatever, I'll be honest, one of the things I think I fear along with many other people is that if you do start to give something a chance and you like something, later on as it's produced, then it gets canceled. And then, you kind of feel like you wasted your time anyways if you actually act on your interest and maybe decide to binge watch or whatever a certain series or show. You kind of want to at least know that there's going to be material there to consume that's going to be better than, I watched a few episodes or I binged watched one season and now it's canceled. And I don't really have anything else to look forward to. So those are a lot of the things that I'm thinking about in concern or in consideration for what I say as far as not necessarily critiquing or criticism, but just consuming content in all its forms. So I know I kind of went a little bit fast, but I really just had this on my mind earlier today, and I really felt like, I wanted this. This is something I want to do a video voiceover on. So here we are. But I would like to, if you're listening to this, and really any parts, what do you think? Where are you at in terms of how you consume music or TV or any social media or entertainment? Where are you at in terms of your head? Where do you have to be? What do you remember as far as before, and maybe how has that changed? I'd be interested in seeing or hearing what you have to say. But that's what I was thinking about today. So until next time, take care.